Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Marukian.
And I'm Roger Moreano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Roger, this week we had the opportunity to speak with Maura Barclay, who is a certified change management specialist, talent optimization leader, neurofacilitation practitioner, and in particular specializes in thought leadership and specifically working with and around issues of masculinity and privilege. And it was really fascinating conversation. I got a lot out of our discussion with her, and in particular, just kind of thinking about what it means to be, I guess, what it means to be a woman, trying to facilitate these types of conversations around masculinity and to build rapport and trust and relationships with male leaders who often are coming from a very socialized idea of what masculinity means. And so I know that you also had some really interesting thoughts about our conversation with Maura. So yeah, what did you take away from our discussion with her that you thought would be helpful for our listeners to listen out for?
Yeah, well, Maria, your comments are spot on, and I think for me, I was really impressed with the amount of work that Maura is doing in really connecting with and engaging folks in dialogue and in conversation around what are really difficult topics at times for anyone, but she's really reaching and connecting with folks in particular identity groups that oftentimes either have the privilege to not engage at all in these topics or find it difficult to engage in these topics. And so obviously you and I have had a lot of experience in this work, and in our experience, it's very, very challenging at times to get white folks, and particularly white men, and specifically white men in positions of power, to not only engage in these issues or to even believe that they are real, but to have substantive dialogue and really fruitful dialogue and even breakthroughs to get folks to really connect with and understand these issues at a deeper level. And Maura's persistence and I think, dedication to these efforts is really admirable. And it really stood out in a lot of what she had to share with us.
She also, in addition to all of her amazing accomplishments professionally as as sort of a director of people and culture and thought leader and talent optimization, she also has this fascinating background. She was a bodybuilder, she was a firefighter, she was a gymnast. Just really interesting anecdotes that she shared with us about how she has leveraged some of those experiences. And in particular, I think having worked within or experienced very male dominated, again, that super sort of social conditioning notion of masculinity in some of her professional pursuits, that she's leveraged some of that to build relationships with male leaders, and talking about this term toxic masculinity and how she approaches that with her clients and with the people that she's coaching was really fascinating. So yeah, folks, listen to Maura's conversation and some of her experiences, and we hope you enjoy our conversation with Maura Barclay. Welcome, Maura Barclay. We're so happy to have you on the podcast with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Maria and Roger.
So we want our audience to learn a little bit about your backstory. Could you share, just to start off with, Maura, what are some of the messages you received early in your life that have shaped you and your identity, your sense of who you are, how you show up in the world, how you experience the world?
Well, I think I was a very lucky child of the 70s. And I was a tomboy, and I had very liberal, progressive parents. So I never really got told anything that confined me to a particular gender or a way of being by my parents. I did notice though, that, I mean, I was really impacted by television. And I think that was the media made it more difficult for me than anything. So my parents were giving me all kinds of good feedback. And I was seeing a lot of these beautiful, long-haired, very feminine women who were in this position, what appeared to be of power and privilege. And of course, it was all white ladies then, because 70s on television. And so, I saw this representation of what it meant to be a powerful female. And it was very clear to me, power is attractiveness. If you want to get somewhere in this world, you need to be able to be that. And I felt woefully inadequate. Like 5'2", Eastern European genes, competitive gymnast by the time I was 8. I'm built like a Clydesdale. And I just never saw myself represented in the media. I was never tall, thin, gorgeous. I was always cute. I was always a tomboy. I could throw a spiral football, but boys did not care about that. And I thought that was awesome. So I found that I had a great deal of cognitive dissonance growing up, because what I thought was cool was not what people thought were cool was cool. So I always felt like a bit of an outsider. And I guess I started with my parents, because certainly no fault of my parents. This was about media. And I didn't really let that deter me from being a proper weirdo. I just was a little bit sad and didn't have a lot of friends, because, like I said, proper weirdo.
And as your work, you got into your profession, and as your work continued to evolve, you found yourself working with leaders, with CEOs, and so forth. And specifically, it seemed like you were able to draw into bringing in, working with men in those leadership roles, because men are disproportionately represented in those roles, right, in so many areas. And frequently with white men as well. You talk a little bit about this on your website, on your podcast as well. And so you've been able in your work to engage these leaders around important dialogue around inclusion, about what belonging looks like, and a little bit about privilege as well. And that's really no easy task, because it's really hard sometimes to get folks, especially men, to talk about anything at all, right? And so to talk about important matters like that is no easy task. And I'm curious how you were able to engage men on these topics, leaders who are influential, who are involved in really creating success for their organizations or companies. How were you able to get into really having those important dialogues about inclusion and why it matters?
I think this starts with my love of the men in my life, my brother and my father, and what an influence my brother was on me. And probably the reason I was a tomboy is so I could hang out with him. And I have been told by men that I bro out well. This is a phrase they have taught me that I didn't know what that was happening. Most men feel fairly comfortable with me. Like I said, I don't have this sort of like gorgeous lady vibe. I'm more of an approachable female. And the other piece of this is I don't have an axe to grind. And I don't believe that shame, blame, and judgment are going to get us anywhere. And I don't bring that energy to the conversation. I, as much as I possibly can, endeavor to meet these men where they are and acknowledge the difficulties they have had. They're human. And even though they are part of a system that was created by them for them, there's plenty of things that are difficult for these men. And there's a reason these behaviors, we will call them counterproductive behaviors, are coming. They're coming from pain. That's where violence against women comes from. That's where being threatened by women comes from. It's from pain and fear. And men are not allowed, they're not taught how to navigate pain and fear. They just command and control it, because that's what they've been taught to do. And I'm privy to all of that. Do I know what it's like to live in a man's shoes? No, no. And I also am not here to necessarily teach men how to do things. I'm very clear about that. That's not my job. I feel like my role is to give them feedback about the impact.
What is the equivalent of broing out for men, right?
Oh.
So if women can bro out, you can sis out? What's the equivalent for men?
I love cis out or maybe queen out, but but
Ooh.
heterosexual cisgender men might take issue with queen out. But like I like cis out because it's like sister, just like
Mhm.
bro. Like I love my brother and he's been such an influence on me. And men who have sisters know how to be with women. They know how to work with women. They know how to respect women. They know how to have well-boundaried relationships with women, typically, because they have a software, a plugin for that in their mind. So sissing out for men is like being able to just be witness to the pain or the trouble that they've got going on. The challenges is a better word. Look, being able to sit with them and recognize it without feeling like they need to get defensive or
Mhm.
fix it. That's how you sis out. And I know a
Yeah.
lot of men are awesome at just listening and being like acknowledging that sounds really hard.
Mhm.
It's kind of
Yeah.
how men learn to be in successful relationships with women in general. That's, I would say, a
So
little bit of sis out.
yeah, I love that.
I
I'm gonna
love that.
start using that. Um, so, one of the things that you were sharing that I think is really important for us to take some time to suss out is the notion of assimilation to gender roles.
Mm,
And in particular, I'm thinking about how often in the narrative that we're having in DEI conversations, especially focusing on sort of gender inequities, a lot of the focus is often placed very understandably and validly on the impact on women who have to consistently assimilate to a male dominated culture.
yeah.
And yet, at the same time, what I'm hearing you share is that there's also assimilation that men, especially white cisgender heterosexual men, are also experiencing in order to quote unquote fit in. And it really resonated with me because I was just doing some work with a client. This is a very large organization that has traditionally been very male dominated. And the number of quotes from the focus groups that we did across this organization that really reflected this culture of toxic masculinity, right? The cowboy culture, the
Mm,
bro culture, and how women in this culture were talking about the impact they had on them in terms of feeling like, one, no matter what I do, there's only to a certain extent to which I can assimilate because no
right.
matter what, I'm still the girl in the room.
Right.
But also men saying the extent to which they need to assimilate, that they don't feel comfortable in some of these situations where their colleagues are making sexist remarks, are making denigrating jokes about women, and yet they feel as though they either have to laugh along in
Right.
order to be accepted, or they can't stand up or speak out for fear of being retaliated or shunned. And
Right.
so I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about this notion, this term toxic masculinity, and I often think that we consider that from the perspective of how it hurts women, and yet it's also so incredibly destructive for men as well.
Yeah. So what you're talking about specifically is called male policing. And it's that way that men intimidate one another to make sure nobody steps out of line and that everybody is maintaining this inequitable, unsustainable culture of male domination. And I wouldn't necessarily call it, I don't like toxic masculinity because I believe in the sacred masculine. And I have met the men that are truly in their sacred masculine, and they are the most beautiful, courageous, strong individuals. And so for me personally, those two words together are a little bit hard for me. Um, and so I don't put those things together. And I just wanted to put that out there because masculinity is a beautiful thing. And just because someone is not participating at all the levels that are available to them, they're actually they're missing opportunities for themselves and others. So with regard to that, and this is something I discussed in great detail with Brad Johnson in my podcast, there they actually are experiencing something called bystander paralysis. And the only way to change counterproductive or destructive behaviors regardless if they're misogynist or racist. What we're dealing with are people who are asking everybody to remain ignorant and do the absolute minimum and try to maintain their control and power. And the way that they assert this culture of control and power and exclusion is by making jokes and making sure everybody's on board. This is a very specific tactic. I would say I would put it in the category of bully, actually. This is a bullying tactic. You agree with me? Come on, buddy, come on, right? And it doesn't matter who the homogenized group is. I've heard women say some pretty horrific things. I have heard people of a particular ethnic group hurl all kinds of insults at another ethnic group or a sub culture within the same ethnic group. It's a thing. It doesn't make it right. So this is a very specific tactic. And if the people in the room are aware, this is what's going on. They're asking for your complicity. And by being silent, you are complicit. That puts a very tall responsibility on your shoulders to be a bystander. And I know a lot of these men, a good percentage of them, I would say the majority of men, don't agree and don't know how to disagree in a way that is safe. And at the end of the day, if you are in an organization, you are safe because, and this is what HR is for, and I know nobody wants to go down this road. At the end of the day, if you can interrupt the pattern, you have to do it in the first 2 seconds, and doing something like saying anything. And what Brad Johnson recommends is saying just ouch, right? Just that word, then everybody stops. It gets very awkward. And now the process of interruption has begun. And the message is very clear. I'm not interested in this. I don't think it's right. I think it's hurting the company. And this doesn't have to be done in person in the moment, although that is the highest impact way to do it. You can take someone aside and say, hey, I don't agree with this. I don't want you to lose face. I believe in you as a leader. I don't think this is necessary. And I think it is inhibiting our performance as an organization.
And there are so many pressures, right, in terms of facing those narratives and those social constructs that put men in difficult circumstances and often provide the foundation and landscape for men to act out in ways that could be harmful, right? And to try to feed that. And you know, your comments about toxic masculinity earlier, I think, make a lot of sense. And at the same time, I think that sometimes when that term is used in our society, folks hear it as masculinity itself is toxic, right?
Right.
But in reality, I think a lot of what you're talking about is what we're really referring to, right? And so those narratives that have been set into place for centuries, really, that have defined manhood through the prism of violence, of conquest, of dominance, right? Of saying that, you know, men are just naturally hardwired to be these things, right? And whether or not you can cite scientific evidence that demonstrates that there is a propensity for men to act aggressively or what have you, the real conversation really has to get to, when we talk about toxic masculinity, is achievement taking place at the exploitation or expense of others? Are we creating a society where we continue to allow for one group to dominate in ways that is dehumanizing to others, right? Whether it be women or to folks from other underrepresented groups. And so, you know, how can we get, I guess, a conversation going, a movement going on what it means to be a real man? You talked a little bit about how that perpetual adolescence is present, right? And there have been numerous folks that have studied this. Michael Kimmel, who's a sociologist, has written about this extensively in his book Skyland, and others that have followed, about how men are rewarded almost for being in that perpetual state of adolescence, right? Where the narratives of conquest, of sexual, you know, conquest even, in terms of living a life that, you know, is centered around your own entertainment and your own, consumption, right? That is kind of what the norm has been set. How can we get a conversation to get men in particular to understand that living a life of just consuming and absorbing and taking what you think is yours has not only detrimental effects to others and to society, but to men themselves, right? And to really take head on the narrative that manhood is defined by violence and conquest, right? That manhood has different ways of showing up that is potentially out there that could be really beneficial. If you want to use, you know, aggression or conquest as your norms, can we redefine how that shows up to say we want to have conquest over social injustice? Do we want to have, the ability for folks and men to be warriors for the well-being of others, right? Rather than the Andrew Tate type narrative that's out there that continues to gain traction among young men. So what are your thoughts about all that?
Well, it's a very interesting notion to pivot the paradigm of hero work and help redefine what courage actually looks like. I think one of the biggest impediments is there's very little representation in mass media. You are just not seeing that represented. It's difficult to create a paradigm shift without a representation of it, to get the body to see it. I mean, I believe part of what we're up against here is a physiological issue. I think a lot of this is invisible, and they don't know how to value something that is invisible, right? Because there's no way you can't brag about, like there's this, we have to, everything, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time, how can we help men? This is to answer your question with the question, how can we help men value these things that typically are the fly in the face of what they're taught? I mean, if you think about how men define their own worth, and I think this is where we would begin, worth is how much power and influence you have, right? So let's start with what's motivating it. How much power and influence you have. So you want the titles, you want the big job, you want the privilege and the prestige of having that because it validates you. Then you want the beautiful wife, right? This is what's being taught. And you want all the toys. So you need to have men fear you, women want you, and be enviable. Until we can change that, it's going to motivate men to do whatever they have to do to get it.
Yeah, and the challenge with that is that that traditional narrative of what manhood means is being challenged. And it's being challenged by the reality that that's not the only way manhood exists, right? So we have so many different ways that men show up in the world. Cisgender men, trans men, and everything in between, right? And I think getting away from the reality that not all men have the capacity nor have maybe the desire to express physical strength as an aspect of their manhood, right? That that's a traditional way of looking at things, but that all of it is valid, right? And I think that and putting down or demeaning or saying a person's not a real man or a real leader or a real what have you because they don't express or live out in a way that visibly demonstrates that traditional narrative or ideal of what a man is going to be really crucial, because the other aspect of it, Maura, and I think you're right on point, that we see very few examples of manhood that are outside of the tradition. But when there are attempts to do that, we are also living in a society and in times that has pushed back against all of those, right? What, as being too woke or what have you. And there's a resistance. And you mentioned earlier, the gatekeepers of traditional masculinity are working really hard to resist that, right? So it is going to be a challenge, I think. And I think sometimes it makes me think that when the world, as you mentioned earlier, was set up for you to work for you and that you were the one that was kind of running the ship, when suddenly we're insisting upon a world where more people have access, more people have equity, suddenly that privilege and that kind of that ownership of the ship, having kind of equal opportunity there kind of suddenly feels like oppression to the privileged, right? But really what we're doing is trying to create a more equitable world for more folks to be able to live authentically as they are and defining that in their own way.
Yeah, and you just said something that I think is really important. Men are trained for the zero-sum game, and that is why they are one of the reasons I believe that they are so aggressive and dominant, because they've been taught the pie is this big and I'm getting mine. Get out of my way. And what they fail to understand, because they don't see it, is that when you invite more people to the party, the pie gets bigger.
You were naming emotions earlier, and I think that's so powerful, right? That it's when we're coming from a place of fear, when we are coming from a place of feeling as though our very existence is is being threatened, that's
Mhm.
where we tend to see this level of resistance to any sort of change to the proverbial status quo. And you know, I wanted to talk a little bit too about the fear that you named related to uh, you know, for men, and particularly cisgender, I think cisgender white men a lot of times, right? The fear of not being seen as quote unquote strong, and
Mhm.
that perception that strength equals being able to be the hero, solve the problems, and in particular, I see this play out, and I'm curious to hear, you know, some of the stories of how you have seen this and how you address it. This work requires us to be, as you said, vulnerable and to embrace the messiness of it. I think in one of your podcast episodes, you even said when DEI is done right, it ain't no kumbaya situation, right? We need to embrace the imperfection of it.
Yeah.
We need to, as Roger said earlier, not approach this from a task-oriented, problem-solving approach. And yet that is what men have been conditioned, all of us to some extent have been
Right.
conditioned, but in particular, men have been conditioned and rewarded for solving the problems. So how do you approach that in your conversations with leaders? What are, you know, if there are any particular examples or stories that show up for you in terms of when you see that shift in mindset, what does it take for us to support everybody, and in particular men, in dismantling that notion that they have to solve all the problems?
Well, and
Well,
I just
yeah.
want to just really quickly add to that, that inherently there's nothing wrong with being a problem solver and striving to be a problem solver, or being strong both physically and emotionally. There's nothing, that's not what anyone is saying, right?
Right.
What we're saying is that your manhood and how you're defined as a successful or not successful person is tied to those, and that if you don't accomplish that to the nth degree, then you are not a good leader and not a man, right? And I think that's the crux of it.
So anyone who's coming in to talk to, and by the way, not for nothing, I have a quarter sleeve tattoo. I have biceps and deltoids for days. I was a firefighter. I've got title winning bodybuilder on my resume. Men know that I understand that stuff. They know I understand the heart to be an athlete. I was competitive gymnast, you know, blah, blah, blah. That's part of my broing out. That is my, I would call it my bro card, that I understand like that level of going to the gym and doing hundreds and having a trash can there because it's time to cut and I'll probably throw up when I do my 100th squat. Like most women don't have that in their lived experience, but
Most men
men,
don't have that in their lived
well,
experience.
it's an athlete's thing. Okay, fair enough. But that level of like, ugh, right? Like that they feel I can understand a part of their world and understand. I mean, being a firefighter, being strong is the badge of honor. The bigger your biceps, the more people trust you, the more people want to go into a fire with you. So, I mean, that was one of the reasons that I had to lift weights for the job, but I'm a very little person. So I had to really build myself so they would trust me. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, and Roger, you referred to this, men in this culture, some men, and if you are going to go have a conversation with the men, you have to go in understanding that they have coupled their self-esteem, all of their value to being a problem solver, to being strong, to being the person who provides safety. That is their raison d'etre. That is why they're here. That is what they're focused on, and being and having more power, gathering resources from a anthropological perspective. That's what these men are doing. They're dominating to maintain the resources so that they can be better providers, so that they can feel that they are valuable. The way to decouple those things is first by acknowledging that it exists, and the attempt to decouple it will destabilize these men emotionally. It will mess with their psyche. They are going to hold on with everything they've got because we are trying to dismantle their self-esteem and their worth. That's how it feels to them. We're coming for them. So instead of trying to stop that, instead, we offer legitimate ways that they can see their value. And part of that is recognizing, how do you feel when you solve a problem? And you get to dig into what that feels like for them. So they're talking about feelings, but they're talking about feelings of victory. So you keep everything couched in language and experiences that are comfortable to them. And then you start to pivot a little bit. Well, what is it that, how do you think it would feel for someone? You give an equivalent example, because I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but you start to create equivalent examples that have nothing to do with winning. It's winning in different ways. You pivot the win, you pivot the victory, you pivot the paradigm to start to build the relationship in their understanding, in their consciousness. These things, these softer things, we need you for those. You don't realize how much you are needed. You don't realize how much we want you here, how valuable you are in this space.
Maura, thank you so much. It's so many great examples. And I think also examples really reflecting the complexity of this work and the nuance of it, and how oftentimes, especially when it comes to our interpersonal relationships, around any biases, and specifically talking today about gender identity differences, that it is often contextual, right? But what I'm taking away from this conversation, I think this is something that we often talk about in our work too, Roger, is that the more power an individual has, the more advantages that have been offered to you because of your, whether it's whatever identities you belong to that societally give you advantages, whether it is the power or the status or ranking you have within your organization, the more power you have, the more the onus needs to be on you to put yourself into those awkward situations, to speak up, because others will listen. So Maura Barclay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It has been a pleasure, and we look forward to talking with you again.
Well, thank you so much, Maria and Roger. It has been my great honor to have a platform to share my weirdo ideas. So I really appreciate you both.
Well, we are fellow weirdos as well, and we love the weirdos of the world. So thanks for joining us.
Weirdos unite. Right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moreano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.